On stage. We're really lucky to have this guy.
Thank you, Steve.
Take it away.
Thank you very much. The first thing I want to do is thank Eric for being my beta tester for the microphone and the clicker. That's always wonderful. And I wanted to add, Eric and I were talking yesterday morning over breakfast, and I shared with him that the high point of my career was in 1994 when my particular startup was ranked 36th on the Inc. 500. Now, what I just told you is my career has been in decline for 20 years. So, I hope that doesn't dissuade you from my message. What I'm going to share with you is a slightly different perspective than Eric has shared. And one of the things that he mentioned was how much luck actually plays into the success of entrepreneurship. And my message to you today is I'm going to show you some ways to improve the luck. How many people are familiar with card counting? Why am I not surprised? If you've ever played blackjack, you know that it is the most likely for you to win. The odds are still in the favor of the house, but the fact is that you actually stand a better chance at winning at blackjack than any of the other games, except if you can learn how to card count. And what you're doing in card counting is you're basically keeping track of where all the high value cards are, and you know whether the deck has a lot of high value cards left in it and what the odds are that they're going to come. Well, I'm going to teach you a little bit about how to card count in the coming economy. The other thing I'm going to warn you about is what I'm going to walk you through today is what I spend approximately 4 hours talking to executives of large companies about. Now, when I was talking to my team, they said, how are you going to condense 4 hours into 30 minutes? And I said, it's easy. I'm talking to a bunch of entrepreneurs. They will get it much faster than the executives of large companies ever will. So what I want to key in is the future is volatile, it is uncertain, it's going to be complex, and it's going to be ambiguous. And what I'm going to hope to do is give you a little bit of vision about the future, a little bit of understanding about the future, a little bit of clarity about the future, and a little bit of a perspective on how you can be agile, because the key to dealing with what's happening is your ability to respond to it. Now, leveraging off, and Steve did a wonderful job of introducing the concept. Niels Bohr had a very famous expression. He said, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, but understand that you can begin to forecast. You can begin to get a feel for the future. By the way, I talked to, the seed's going to make all of the slides available to you. I am going to be rushing through them a little bit. In fact, this presentation has been referred to taking a drink of water from a fire hose. But all of the slides will be available to you, and you'll have them for references. Here's just a group of people who have actually made significant contributions to the process that I'm going to quickly walk you through so that you have a certain sense of credibility about where the ideas I'm going to share come from. To the point, it's very, very difficult to forecast or predict the future. But what you can do if you are disciplined about it is you can actually identify what's probably going to happen, what's possible, what's plausible, and basically begin mapping out what are the different variations and what's going to happen in those variations. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to leave you with what we have come up with within the Dell group. To begin with, starting point is what we call foresight. It's a process that we use looking at what's going on in the world and trying to figure out where things are going. And it's critically important because if you're an entrepreneur or if you want to be an innovator, it's not necessarily what is happening now, but is anticipating and meeting an unmet need in the future that is actually going to be the source of growth and profitability into the future. So we put all of these things together and we combine them. There we go. With a process that we call insight. And what we're doing with Insight is we are looking internally at our capabilities, and we are looking at the things that I would call easy to predict. There's something within the tech space called Moore's Law, that every 18 months, prices are cut in half and performance is doubled. So we're looking at the easy to predict and basically the internal capabilities of the organization to then, at some point in time, marry against the foresight activity. So what my group actually does within Dell is we don't innovate Dell's products and services. We are trying to help Dell itself become a more innovative company. And one of the ways we do this is we provide these views of the future so that when people want to come up with new products and services, they know what they are targeting it toward. So what we do is we take our foresight and our insight, and I jokingly say what I do is I take my insight team and my foresight team, I put them into a padded room, I throw in raw meat, and whichever one comes out alive is basically the one that was correct. What generally happens in the activity is the insight people will tell the foresight people that you have been using too many recreational substances, so to speak. But what really happens, and when the really great ideas come to play, is when the foresight people are able to convince the insight people that, hey, this maybe really could happen. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff, and I threw those up there to tell you that especially if you're in a large company, I can talk all day to a senior exec about what might happen, but he wants to know when is it going to happen and how much it's going to cost me. One of the interesting things about entrepreneurs is they tend to be mission-driven and purpose-driven, and cost and timing is a little bit less of an issue. But there's a whole bunch of other things that we do relative to forecasting what the value propositions are going to be, how you could interact with it, what the nature of innovation is, how innovation will cycle through the organization. One of the things that I want to call your attention to, and it's one of the reasons that large companies find innovation very, very difficult, is most innovation is driven from failure. It is your ability to tolerate failure, to try over and over again. The term grit was used by Eric. That actually is where successful innovations come from. So what we have started to do within our organization is to develop a portfolio approach. In fact, almost the venture capital approach. One of the reasons that I can't really say that my career has been in a downhill slide for the last 20 years is right after I sold the TRC to Perot Systems, I decided that my next challenge was how could I make large companies innovative and entrepreneurial. If you'll remember in the late 90s, the buzzword was intrapreneurship. It was a buzzword. But we are finding new ways to do it. I went and did a internal venture capital group, which is a new model, and I'll talk a little bit about that and your roles that it plays for entrepreneurs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the future. The basis of the future is actually innovation. And we need to talk a little bit about innovation because somebody asked the question about products and services. What we have found is that innovation in particular, products and services, a new product, a new service is probably not the best source of innovation. In fact, what we have found is the most successful innovations are business models. How many people remember when the iPod came out? Apple's iPod. A few of you, okay. Well, the interesting thing about iPod is people think the iPod was an extremely innovative product. The fact is it was a natural progression of the MP3 player. The innovation, the disruption of the marketplace was actually a new business model called iTunes. And we see this over and over again, the truly disruptive, truly breakthrough businesses, Uber, Airbnb, are not products and services, they are radically different business models. So when you're thinking about being an entrepreneur, oftentimes your business model is much more important than necessarily the products and service. Because what you've done is you've generally found a need in the marketplace. This is something that's not happening. That's the basis of the products and service. It's how you go about assembling the resources to create it and how you go about delivering it that will really be the significant difference going forward. Now, one of the things that we've learned in my group is you can talk about the future, you can give charts, you can give statistics, you can give facts and figures, and 30 seconds after the executive has left the room, he's totally forgotten what you're talking about. So what we do is we take these future scenarios and we create science fiction stories. And I'm going to share 2 stories with you today to give you a flavor of what the future looks like and how you may fit into it. I'll start with one of the scenarios we call the frictionless economy. Imagine, if you will, two guys decide to go fishing. They get in their boat and they row it out into the lake, and they're casting and they're reeling and they're casting and they're reeling. And all of a sudden they realize that with a minor change to that reel, they can catch a whole lot more fish. So they row the rowboat back in, they go home, they get on their laptop, they bring up a free software as a service CAD/CAM package. They locate, how many people are familiar with the Makers Movement? The Makers Movement, how many people are familiar with open source software? Bigger group. Okay, well, the Makers Movement is the atom equivalent to the open source electronic world. Basically, you can get on the internet now a design for pretty much anything in the world that you want to build and can print it off on a 3D printer or have a CNC machine create something for you. So they go back, they get on the CAD/CAM system, they bring up a design for a reel, they make a minor modification to the reel, they ship the file over to Kinko's FedEx. Within the States, Kinko's and FedEx is in the process of installing 3D printers in all of their locations. So in the same way that you would go get a copy made today, you can actually go print out a physical object. So they get it, they show it to their friends make some comments, they make some improvements, they put it up on Kickstarter and they start a Kickstarter campaign. So they get, $20,000, $50,000 on the Kickstarter campaign. They ship off the design to an offshore job shop manufacturer. They sign up with UPS for logistics and distribution. They open up an Amazon storefront, and then 90 days later, they go fishing again. This time it's on their 100-foot yacht. That's what we mean by the frictionless economy. If you think about how a product came into being in the past, what you had to do is you had a huge amount of capital that was involved. You were moving atoms from point to point. Let's say you wanted to create something that was made out of metal. What you would do is somebody had to create the mine. Somebody had to build a railroad to get the ore from the mine to the smelter. Somebody had to build another railroad to get from the smelter to the factory. Somebody had to build, there's huge capital investment in the factory. Somebody had to build a road and trucks to get the products from the factories to the retail outlet, on and on and on. Huge amounts of capital. Huge amount of information involved. Information that was unique and specialized by each one of the steps in the supply chain. Crossing the geographic boundary, space becomes critically important. And lastly, the access to capital. When I started out as an entrepreneur, I would go to the bank and say, I have a really wonderful idea. I need about $20,000. I'm going to make us all rich. Now, I had a good relationship with my bank, and they said, Jim, we really like you, we trust you, there's some coffee over there, there's some donuts over there, and when you're done, the door's there. Now, somebody like Michael Dell, could go to that very same bank and say, I have a brilliant idea, could be exactly the same idea, and I need $100,000 because large companies need a lot more money to do the same thing we entrepreneurs can do. And the answer is, Mr. Dell, no problem, go upstairs, the champagne and caviar is on ice. When you're done eating, we'll have the contracts drawn up for you. There was a huge friction in capital. Not anymore. What was it? Oculus Rift was able to raise $42 million on Kickstarter to get started. So capital is no longer a friction. Distance is no longer a friction because all of you can sign up for UPS and basically you can get supplies or whatever you want anywhere in the world. And information is no longer a friction because you have access to the world's information available to you. So in effect, what has happened is those four frictions, time, space, access to capital, and access to information, were the basis of large companies growing large. So suddenly what we have in the frictionless economy is two guys in a rowboat compete against a huge, large organization. So that's one change that's coming to the future. The other change is something we call the serendipity economy. How many of you have ever woken up in a hotel room and said, how did I get here? Why am I here? What am I doing? Clearly you all don't travel a lot, or you don't party as well as some of the people I know. Well, I'm from the older generation. I have a smartphone. Believe it or not, I bought that smartphone basically to make phone calls. I know that's unusual and weird, but I bought my smartphone basically to make phone calls. But when I wake up in the middle of the night in that hotel room and I suddenly don't know where I am or why I'm there, that smartphone is more valuable to me in that moment. I may be happy to pay $20, $50 a month to be able to make a phone call, but in that moment of panic, it's priceless because it has my calendar. It knows where I'm at. I'm at the hotel. I'm attending this conference. But more importantly, it can say, and oh, by the way, 4 of your friends are also attending this conference. And the 5 of you happen to be in this foodie group, and you've been talking about this new Texas Indonesian fusion barbecue, and it just so happens 4 blocks down the street, there's a restaurant opening up that serves that. All of your calendars are free at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. There's an opening reservation. Do you want me to make it? What happened to the value of that phone? It went from here, where I make phone calls with it, to way up here where it created a whole lot more value for me. And after it makes that reservation, what's its value? All the way back down to here. That's what we mean about the serendipity economy. The future belongs to those companies that can identify the context of their customers, where they are, who they're with, what they want to do, what's available to them, the resources that are around them, and immediately provide value in that moment. So taking those 2 stories, what does that mean to businesses? Well, the first thing it says to us is that it's all about ecosystems. Think about that phone example that I gave you. Multiple apps running on multiple services using multiple network interfaces, all were collaborating together to create that value in the moment. That only happens in an ecosystem. If you think about what's happening across all of the app space, it's all based upon ecosystems. The future is ecosystems. In fact, what becomes critically important in the future is not your product and service, it's your relationship with your customer. Because you want to be in that evoke set whenever the customer has a need or there's an opportunity to deliver value to that customer. And what does that mean? You can't be all things to all people, so you'll have to focus on that particular customer. So what we're seeing happening is 2 things. We're seeing more and more highly specialized companies come into the marketplace who are basically focused on how can I create value for my customers? And I will never do anything that doesn't create value for my customers. So you're seeing small and medium-sized enterprises begin to not have legal departments, not necessarily to have marketing departments, maybe don't have IT departments, and instead creating these ecosystems of collaboration to create value for their customers at any particular point in time. And by the way, through all the slides, I've identified some articles available on the HBR site, which talks about the points we're making in each of these slides. So the starting point is ecosystems. It is a matter of collaboration and co-creation. And when I say ecosystem, it's not just your partners and suppliers, it's your customers, it's the society, it's the government as a whole. The next thing that becomes apparent is when you start talking about ecosystems, the behavior becomes less the traditional engineered organizational behavior, and it becomes more organic, it becomes more adaptable, it becomes more flexible. What you see up here is a model that we've been working on in terms of understanding what a future organization is like and how is it going to grow and how is it going to interact with other organizations. So it's a shift from the tradition, as we jokingly say, instead of studying Eiffel, you need to be studying Darwin now in terms of how organizations behave. In addition to the new organization models, you're going to see new operating models. What you see up here is something that comes out of the complex adaptive systems space. It's called the Kniffen framework, and it talks about how one goes about making decisions in environments. The dirty little secret of large companies is they're basically simple systems. If you look at most companies, if there is a problem, they identify what the problem is, and then they go look for the best practice to solve that problem. If you look in the small and medium enterprises, they're a little bit more complicated. They basically don't know as much, perhaps, as a large company does in terms of its operation because it doesn't have all of the accountants and all the IT systems. So what they do is they bring in a consultant to figure out the answer, and then they go find the best practice. Well, the problem with best practices is If you're using best practices, it only means you're no worse than anybody else. If you want to succeed, you have to be better than everybody else. And that introduces us into this world of complex systems, which is basically your ability to sense, your ability to see what is happening, and that happens when you have incredibly fluid information flow within your organizations. The other thing that we're seeing in these new models is a reassessment of risk. Many companies and many organizations make their decisions basically on financial risk assessments. What we are seeing, especially if you think about this idea of ecosystems, is your reputation, trust, your ability to deliver, the ability to do things for your customer perhaps without even a contract being in place, or suppliers who will come to your need, come to your help without a bunch of lawyers getting involved. So it's a changing matter of risk as well. The one last thing that we're seeing that changes the nature of business as we go forward into the future is this idea that capitalism has failed. Now, the reality is capitalism has not failed. Capitalism has done more to improve people's lives across the world than any other one thing. But the change is capitalism has never been fully accounted for. In fact, there is a number of studies that are going on that perhaps 80% of the value of a company is not reflected in its financial statements. So what you are seeing are new forms of corporate governance. The term that's being used is shared value enterprises, where the value of the company, the way you run the company, the way you measure the company, is its total impact on the environment, the society, your employers, your suppliers, and you in turn share the wealth that is created by the organization. How many people are familiar with the term shareholder primacy? So in a lot of, we in the States hear it all the time. It is the fact that most companies are incorporated with the rule that all decisions should be made for the benefit of the shareholder first. Shareholder wealth creation becomes the primary function or the shareholder primacy of the organization. What we are now seeing are new models where wealth is created by the organization as a whole and then equally or fairly distributed among all of the participants in the organization and the ecosystem as we've expressed it. And what you see there is a list of the different forms of incorporation that are coming into being. Interestingly, these are the fastest growing forms in the United States. You're seeing more and more companies being formed in terms of these benefit corporations than anything else. Now, you sum all these up, what does the company of the future look like? How many people have some background in the software world? Lion's share or technology space. What we are now talking about is the future enterprise is a software-defined enterprise, an organization that adapts itself in the moment by what's happening with its customers. I currently have one project, for example, that's heavily invested in what we call a self-adaptive supply chain. How can you create a supply chain that responds without the intervention of 6 million people trying to coordinate something? How does it naturally happen? So what you're really talking about is shifting to a world that is not necessarily engineered, but that once again is organic, that responds to the environment as quickly as possible, or as we refer to it, a software-defined enterprise. So how do you get started with this? The way that what we have identified, and we call it the 9 questions, that every enterprise has to ask itself when it's putting together its organization, when it's saying, okay, what am I going to do tomorrow? The first question is basically this: does this thing that I'm about to do create value for my customers? If the answer is yes, you should be doing it. If the answer is no, you probably shouldn't do it. Go find a partner in your ecosystem who can do it for you. Are you the best in the world at doing it, or could you be the best in the world at doing it? If the answer is yes, you should be doing it. If the answer is no, you should be finding somebody in your ecosystem to do it for you, because what's the primary purpose of your enterprise? to satisfy to get and keep a customer. And if that means using a competitor to provide some of the services, that's what you want to do because the customer is king. Or do you have to do it for legal or regulatory reasons? Unfortunately, we will always be stuck with some level of legal and regulatory responsibilities that we have to do. Then there's 3 additional questions you have to ask yourself. Am I doing this because it's received wisdom? I attended a conference like this, or I went to school and got my MBA, and they said, you must do this if you're going to be a successful business. Maybe yes, maybe no. Or is it tradition? We've always done it this way. That has killed more businesses and will kill more businesses in the future than anything else. Or do the actual physics of providing value to my customer require me to perform this activity? Then I should be performing this activity. And when you're done with those 6 questions, what you then have to ask yourself, what do I need to start doing? What do I need to stop doing? And what do I need to do different to be successful? Again, this begins filling in this concept of an ecosystem. And what you're starting to see is you're starting to see large companies move in this direction. We recognize that we can't invent everything, that we cannot innovate everything. You're seeing more and more companies basically get rid of some of their internal departments and basically use an ecosystem to deliver it. You're seeing more and more partnerships between large companies and smaller companies. In fact, what we think the future will be is that large companies will be the hosts for lots and lots of small and medium enterprises and startups in terms of creating values for their customers. Now, believe it or not, I actually do spend 4 hours talking about these things, but what I want to do is give you the opportunity to actually ask as many questions as you want. At any point in time, feel free to reach out to me, either through email or any of the other, and I'll be glad to point you to some of the other material. Also, I believe I'm doing a session this afternoon, which we will actually walk through that process of what do you start, stop, and do differently and how to think about that. So with that, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I almost want to ask, if the audience doesn't mind, the first question, which is you mentioned something about best practices, meaning you're just doing as good as everyone else, maybe, and we have to do better.
I said you're no worse than
anyone. No worse than anyone else. And then also about tradition, sort of holding companies back. I've also been frustrated with the term best practice, meaning there's no better way to do it because it's the best. Do you see big companies realizing this now? Because, you know, the big 4 consulting companies still push this, like this is best practice, hire us. Are the big companies getting wise and saying, well, wait a minute, we don't want to do it like IBM or like everybody else. We want to find our own path and working towards that, or what's the trend?
Well, I think you're seeing a couple of things. And first, in full disclosure, going back to something that Eric talked about, I started my company for different reasons than some that you gave. I started mine because I wanted to prove the experts were wrong. Okay, which is not necessarily the best reason, you know, certain bullheadedness, but we made it to 36th, right? So we must have done something right. Yeah. No, and bear with me a little bit. I'm going to tell you another little story, okay? And these 2 guys come out of a bar, and they find a gentleman down on the sidewalk, and he's feeling around. He's underneath a street light, and he's feeling around. And they look at him and say, is there a problem? Is there something wrong? And he said, no, there's nothing wrong other than I've lost my keys and I'm searching for my keys. And he said, well, you know, we'll help you. So they get down on their knees and they're searching around under the streetlight for the keys. And they're not finding the keys. And finally, one of the guys asked the original gentleman, well, are you sure you lost them here? And he said, no, I actually lost them way over there, but the light's so much better here. That's what best practices are. The light's better here. They don't necessarily apply to all companies. And I think one of the things that's come out, remember my comment about the serendipity economy? That a value proposition exists only for a moment in a particular context. That means every customer experience will be unique. And if it's unique, by definition, there's not a best practice there. You're customizing on the fly. So that's my personal perspective. Now, what you're starting to see more and more companies move in that direction. One of the reasons you're seeing more companies move into as-a-service offerings is the ability for it to be unique for each individual expert as opposed to an actual product. And I should add, one of the major things that we're seeing that's a difference in the coming economy is people are not selling products anymore. They give the products away, and the products become a window into their services. And so if you're looking at starting a company today, one of the things to focus on is this idea of how do I get and maintain contact with the customer, and that's not a transaction. And the biggest change that we're seeing in large companies is a shift away from a transactional model to a relationship model. And it's also why we think large companies will basically be the foundations of these ecosystems that small companies will play in.
Awesome. We have a question. Wait,
Yeah.
wait 1 second. We have 2 questions lined up. So one there, and then we'll do Eric's as well.
And I don't know about Eric's.
Eric's going to have to wait. He's coughing anyway.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Jim. It was a great speech. We already had a chance to speak last night. My name is Bjorn. For the benefit of the audience, maybe I'm German, and I'm an ex-investment banker and ex-lawyer turned tech startup entrepreneur.
I'm glad you've come to the good side.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask, I really like that paradigm that you've outlined here about the ecosystems. To me, it sounds it's just like a more fashionable or more trendy word for something that has been going on for quite several decades, which is outsourcing in a way, right? And I want to challenge that proposition in one aspect. I mean, not everything that you outsourced turned out to be a good idea, because what you then hit is a problem of accountability.
Yes.
And you have an interface issue. And for the customer, it may not always be a good idea because he will not know who is actually who he's talking to. And then you call customer support, and the company tells you, yeah, it's not us, it's our delivery company, or it's our provider, or it's our this and this thing. So how do you deal with that issue? I think that's kind of an interesting problem.
Absolutely great question, because ecosystems are now outsourcing arrangements. And again, I'm going to share with you by example. Can you imagine your business having no recourse to a legal system? So that you couldn't have contracts, you couldn't have employment agreements. Then again, you wouldn't be paying taxes either, so there's an upside. Well, believe it or not, there are organizations that exist that way. And those organizations are some of the ones that we're studying to figure out exactly how effective ecosystems operate, because I would argue that outsourcing tends to be a transactional activity as opposed to a relationship activity. So I will give you 2 examples of organizations that function very effectively as ecosystems based upon relationships, trust, mutual respect, and accountability as opposed to a contract. The first are drug cartels. Now, there's good news and bad news associated with them, but they are actually based upon extremely high levels of trust. Now, in some cases, it's a negative type of trust. There are consequences if you don't do what you say you were going to do. And as a consequence, though, they have high level of trust because they are 99.999% sure that the person that said they're going to do something is going to do it. Now, that's very Darwinian, by the way, because the survival of people who don't keep their words is very low, and so after time you get this population of people who are always going to keep their word and do what they say they're going to do. Also within China, there is a group of companies that are referred to as the Shanzai. The Shanzai are the companies that make a lot of the knockoff products. Because what they do is basically illegal, they don't have the ability to do contracts. If you basically engage one, it's generally done with a phone call saying, look, I want this new MP3 player, I want it to look like this. And then what they do is among themselves, they self-organize. One says, I'll take on design responsibilities, I'll take on integration activities, I'll take on manufacturing of this, I'll do the packaging, I'll take care of the logistics and distribution, without ever a lawyer or procurement person ever being in place. And those of you who are selling to large companies know that that's a tremendous benefit if you can avoid legal and procurement. And the way they operate is upon this high level of mutual trust. So when we talk about ecosystems, we're not talking about outsourcing. We're talking about the ecosystem, the individual participants or agents in the ecosystem, be it individuals or companies, responding to a need to another part of the ecosystem with what they are best at doing and meeting the needs, and then we'll share the wealth or gain. How many people have heard the term gain sharing? Within the states right now, the newest form of contracting is not a pay for service, it is a gain sharing. You agree that you're going to do this, and if we get a 20% reduction in cost, you'll get 10% of it back. So it is not the traditional outsourcing, it's moving to these more independent, these more dependency relationships and gain sharing models. So when we talk about ecosystems, we're not talking about outsourcing, although outsourcing is a good precursor to what ecosystems are going to do.
Awesome. Now, Eric up next, and then maybe one more, and we've got to run. So,
Jim, I wonder if you could expand upon B Corps and double bottom line companies.
Okay.
And then also if you could direct the question out to the audience, because I'm curious as to what kind of penetration that kind of organization has in this region.
Great question. How many people have heard the term B Corp or Benefit Corp or Flexi? A few of you. Okay. What there is, in 1987, a new form of incorporation, which basically defines how a company is going to be run. The LLC was created in the States. Nothing has happened until 2006 or 7, I'm not real sure when it was, when all of a sudden a ton of new forms of incorporation came into being. Those corporations had one unique difference. And this is a little esoteric, and you'll probably never remember it or care. There was a 1932 Supreme Court decision, Dodd v. Ford.
I'm not that old.
Huh?
I'm not that old.
In which the court said that the primary responsibility of a board of directors was to ensure shareholder wealth creation. It's Dodd v. Ford is the actual reference. And ever since then, CEOs have used that excuse. How many people have heard the term, I'm sorry, but it's just business?
I hate that term.
I hate that term. I hate that term as well, because if you go back and boy, am I a geek, okay? When you go back and study Dodd v. Ford, that's not what the court said. The court said you should consider shareholder wealth creation in all of your decisions, but you're not required to make it the prime decision. And most CEOs won't tell you that, because like my drunk searching for his keys under the street light, it's easier to just say I'm doing this for those reasons than I'm doing it for others. So what created in the early 2000s are these new forms of incorporation, which gives legal protection to the board and the management if they make decisions that don't primarily focus on shareholder wealth creation. They can say, I'm doing this for the entirety of the society that I operate in, that what I am focusing on is creating organizational wealth to be fairly distributed among all stakeholders of the firm, not just the shareholders. Each one has a little different in the rules on how they do it. It's the fastest growing form of incorporation, and the reason that it's there, how many people have heard the term activist investor? Hope you never heard, it's my sincere hope you never hear that term. How many people have heard of Carl Icahn?
Unfortunately.
The ultimate activist investor. These are people who come in, buy up just enough stock to potentially get a position on the board, and their argument is that you are not performing your fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder wealth. They take over the company and they end up breaking them up, selling them up, doing all kinds of things that may or may not be good depending on your position. So all of this was created to eliminate that part of the financial industry. So that being, and to give then people who want to go start and do good as opposed to just make money the opportunity. In fact, what I would add is the interesting thing is we're starting to see a huge amount of philanthropic investment move away from giving to charities and NGOs and nonprofits and go into these new types of corporations. Because I can give $100 million to a nonprofit and they'll partial it out over a couple of years. I can give $100 million to one of these benefit corporations and they can continuously cycle generating benefits. So you're seeing a shift in investment there. So question, how many of you have seen of, heard of, or know about this new form of corporate governance or incorporation? A few of you. It's something to look into. It gives a tremendous amount of more freedom to you as an executive, as a manager. Now, the thing you have to talk about is why would a shareholder or an owner give up that power? And it turns out that most new entrepreneurs aren't in it, to your point, for the money. They're in it to do good or solve a problem. And so it's a better fit for the... Basically, it's a way to get Wall Street out of here. It's basically what it was formed up for.
I love this discussion, but we actually are running late. We have 5 minutes technically. The organizers are going to be mad at me, but let's do it anyway. If both of you can keep it to a 1-minute question and a 1-minute answer.
Yes, sir.
Go.
Hello, my name is Theodore, and I'm dealing with production of organic food. I really like the thing that you mentioned about business model innovation, but my question is a little bit about the side of capitalism that you mentioned. Don't you think that right now we're reaching a point where innovation is too quick and people are failing to adapt, which means that a lot of the people in these large corporations are becoming obsolete? So for example, you bring in a company with 2 guys that is able to do the jobs of 50, so the 50 get, they get laid off. And there was a really interesting publication in the MIT that basically said that because of this innovation that all of us are doing, actually this is the reason why median income in the world is falling down and the wealth gap is actually increasing. So do you think that in 10 years innovation will reach such a point that the majority of the population will become obsolete and become unemployable?
Ouch. Good question.
Yeah, and a 1-minute answer?
Maybe, okay, we'll give you 2. We'll give you 2, but that's it.
I
I've
get 2
got a
minutes.
sigh.
I would argue the premise is wrong, and here's what I mean by that. I think the rate of innovation and continuous innovation is nothing but goodness. It is actually a Darwinian process going on. It is basically ensuring that the most adaptable and the most valuable at that point in time are actually succeeding. When you talk about the disproportionate distribution of wealth, that is a function of the financial models that we currently drive our businesses from. If every business first and foremost has to create shareholder wealth, not organizational wealth or societal wealth, shareholder wealth, then the consequence you're going to get is the people who are shareholders are going to get continually more wealthy, and then they are the source of investment for the next one. And so after a while, you see this migration of capital to a small percentage of the population, which is what we're seeing in today. If you change the rules, if you create these companies that have to account in total for all of the value that they consume and all of the value that they create, and then distribute it in an equitable manner, then what all innovation is going to do is going to make everybody wealthier. So it's the literal tide rises all boats. I've often argued that the issue that we have today is the financial system only accounts for a very small part of all of the value that is consumed and all the value that is created, and as a consequence, you're seeing this migration of wealth. So I would argue that the premise is wrong. It is the way we govern companies is the issue, not the rate of innovation.
And Mr. Scarf.
So my question is about the last part of your speech. So how did you assess that change to the hosting model? What I mean, big companies generally treat everybody else in a way beat or eat.
I wasn't understanding the question.
So how did you see that change to the hosting model? Or rather eat or beat everybody else?
Well, how did we actually discover this was going on? It was really by accident, because we saw a couple of things. First off, if you look at most companies, most large companies, They may be generating lots of patents because they have R&D groups, but you aren't seeing a lot of innovation come from them. In fact, if you look at them, a lot of their new products and services are almost universally done in conjunction with a small enterprise, or they have become serial acquirers. And I'll take my company, for example. Over the last 3 years, I think over the last two years, we've acquired over 30 companies of varying sizes. So we saw this one thing happening at large companies, but we needed to understand what was happening at the small companies. And what we saw in the small companies is we saw two things going on. One, we saw this movement to this other form of incorporation, which is actually going to make it harder for them to be acquired by large companies, which creates a whole new dynamic which is why we think it's going to go to ecosystems as opposed to large companies just acquiring small companies, which is what you have going on right now. So we saw that dynamic going on, and then we went to look at what was actually causing those companies to be formed, and it was that the entrepreneurs that are coming into that are actually what we refer to as the millennials, which is a generation that is not basically profit motivated by all intents and purposes, and I'm getting the 1 minute signal here. I will leave you with one other thought. If you want to understand this rethink of how costs are being accumulated, how do I truly change the financial statement to something that truly represents the value of the firm? There is something called the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and that's what they're focusing on, called triple bottom line companies, people, profit, and planet. There is something called the IIRC, the International Integrated Reporting Consortium, which is trying to create something called an integrated bottom line. How do I account for all of the impacts of a company in a single place? There's also something called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is trying to create the equivalent for non-financial value that the Financial Accounting Standards Board has created for traditional financial. The real key to this is people are trying to figure out how to monetize everything a company does, not just the actual transactions and finances.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Woo! Jim?